Hi, I'm Gary Gumbel, founder of BeginningArtist.com, and I'm here to tell you that one really important part of becoming an artist is training your eyes to see the correct proportions of whatever you're drawing or painting. Now, when I say correct proportions, what does that really mean? Well, it means two things. First, you need to be able to see the size relationships of the different parts of a single object. For instance, if you were drawing me, you'd want to make sure that my head was the right size, the right shape, and in the right place on my body, or at least I hope you would. Or say you were painting me and I had my hand in this position. You would want to make sure that you're painting my hand the right size so it looked correct in relation to my head. Now you can see, because my hand is much closer to you than my hand looks almost as big as my head, and it would look much smaller if I had my hand back close to my head. So if you're painting something like this, you need to get those sizes correct. But even on something much simpler, like a wine bottle, if you were going to draw this, you would want to see the proportions of the bottle correctly. You'd want to see how long is the neck in comparison to the length of the body, or how wide is the neck in comparison to the body. And that's just seeing the proportions of one object. The second thing that seeing correct proportions means is seeing the size relationships between one object and the things around it, like this tie-dyed muskox and the barn behind it. Now, if you were going to draw or paint this scene, you would want to make sure that the size and the shape of this rather flamboyant muskox looked right, and you would also want the muskox to be the right size compared to the barn. You don't want to mistakenly draw the muskox so big that it looks like a hairy elephant next to the barn, nor do you want to mistakenly draw it so small that it looks like a dog with horns. Whatever subject you choose to draw or paint, you want the proportions of your subject to look correct, because most of the time you want people to recognize what you've drawn or painted, right? And you want them to be able to appreciate the creativity you put into your work instead of being distracted by seeing something that doesn't look quite right. Well, to prevent that, this is where measuring proportions comes in. And luckily for you, you aren't like architects and engineers. As an artist, you don't have to be absolutely exact in your measurements. Your art only needs to look right. It only needs to be approximately correct. And to be approximately correct, you don't need to use a tape measure or a yardstick. You can establish proportions that are close enough by using a pencil and a paintbrush, like I showed you in the short article above this video. And that's great because it makes the job of creating art not only faster than if we had to measure with a tape measure or a yardstick, it can also be much better for our health and peace of mind. Can you imagine how upset that muskox is after its recent color change? It's much better for you if you have a simple way of measuring its proportions from a safe distance. And that brings up some other questions, like, what should you actually measure? I mean, where should you start? And what if you're working from a photograph? Depending on how big your subject is in the photograph and how big your photograph is, trying to measure small distances with a pencil or paintbrush can be difficult. So what do you do then? And how do you keep this whole process as clear and as simple as possible? Well, questions like these and others that I'll mention later are the reasons I created a DVD called The Beginning Artist's Guide to Measuring Proportion, so you can learn to draw like an artist. And when you're just beginning to develop your art skills, this subject of measuring proportions can seem difficult. Well, after more than 40 years in art, I've learned the best way to do things and the shortcuts that save time and frustration. And I've put that knowledge to work in this DVD to simplify the process so you can learn it quickly and easily, because let's be real here. What you really want to do is get on with creating art. So the goal of learning to measure proportions is to train your eyes to see proportions, see the size relationships, so you can just make art. When you reach that point where you've trained your eyes, then you only need to measure when your drawing seems a little off. And believe me, no matter whether you've been doing art for over 40 decades like I have, or 4 months, there are just some days where you see proportions better than others. And if you run into a little trouble, that's when you go back to basics and check the proportions using what I teach you. The Beginning Artist Guide to Measuring Proportions shows you how to start, where to measure first to keep things simple. In fact, I show you how to measure and draw your subject as very simple shapes first. Because it is so easy to get too involved in the details of your subject, and that makes things way more complicated than they need to be. Believe me, a good rule of thumb in almost anything is keep things simple. In keeping with that rule, I show you a very simple way of measuring proportions on a photograph, where using a pencil might be too cumbersome. I show you how to make one simple measurement and let that become the unit of measure for sizing everything in your picture. I show you easy ways to draw your subject any size you want it. Once you know how, it's really no problem to draw your subject bigger or smaller than reality. And when you start dealing with perspective and have things that go off at various angles, it can sometimes be hard drawing those angles so they look right. I show you simple ways to see those angles correctly and transfer them to your drawing. I show you a very simple aid to doing that when you're working from a photograph. I discovered this shortcut years ago on one of those days when I was struggling with seeing angles and proportions correctly. You'll be surprised how simple it really is. When you're drawing more than one thing, I show you quick ways to make sure things are in their right place in relation to everything else without actually having to measure. These little tricks and shortcuts are also useful when drawing people. And I've included a special bonus section on drawing people. I show you how to simplify measuring the human body and how to ensure that all its parts are positioned correctly. For instance, did you know that when someone is standing with their weight on one leg, like you see here, this point of the neck will always be directly above the inside of the left ankle. And if they have their weight on their right leg, then this point will always be directly above the inside of their right ankle. Now, do you think knowing something like this would be very helpful? Well, of course it would, and these kinds of shortcuts apply to things other than the human body. So, in my DVD, The Beginning Artist's Guide to Measuring Proportion, I show you how to use this and many other aids and shortcuts I've found to simplify the process of measuring and drawing what you see. And I try to make the learning these things fun. You're more likely to remember and use things that you had fun learning. So if you think that having a lesson with a tie-dyed muskox might be fun, then this DVD is probably for you. I invite you to order The Beginning Artist's Guide to Measuring Proportions DVD below this video and start simplifying the process of drawing. And let me show you how to easily make everything you want to draw the right size, the right shape, and how to make sure that it's in the right place. Just click the Buy Now button below and you'll soon be drawing like an artist.